Hi, good evening. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Hashtag Ready's fourth webinar. You have a story, tell it. My name is Lillian Xiao, and I'm a staff member with Crew Singapore. I'm also the lead for the Hashtag Ready team, and I'll be your MC this evening. But before I continue, I'd like to appreciate my team that's helping to run this webinar right now. Two of them are still recovering from COVID and its symptoms, and yet they are faithfully serving so that we can enjoy this webinar tonight to learn together. So if you can join me to appreciate them through encouraging them in the chat, that would be great. Thank you so much. Well, are you ready? Hashtag ready. Ready stands for reaching everyone around you. It's an initiative to activate and empower all Christians, and in particular, young adults, to share Christ in our everyday life. We take our reference from 1 Peter 3:15, which says, "Worship Christ as the Lord of your life, and if someone asks about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it." Let me tell you a little bit more about the Ready campaign. Ready can be described in three phases. So for phase one, as part of Hashtag Ready, we have organized a series of open webinars to equip the church to be an effective witness for Christ in our current digital world. You are here today for webinar number 4, and I'll come back in a bit to do a quick recap of our webinars so far. In phase 2, partnering with the Thirst Collective and the One for Jesus movement over the Lent season from March to mid-April, Crew seeks to come alongside every young adult to share the gospel in everyday life and to be salt and light through a Telegram community channel. You will hear stories from everyday Christians like yourself about how they've tried, succeeded, or failed at attempts to share the gospel, and be encouraged to keep trying. What can evangelism look like? How do you start spiritual conversations? Learn tips from one another and be encouraged to go on this journey of being a faithful witness together with a community. So do join us in our Hashtag Ready Telegram community channel. The link is crew.sg/readytelegram1. Or you can scan the QR code that you will see in the next slide. This is to join our Telegram community channel. At this point, I also want to just give a special mention about the hashtag Publish Peace campaign by one of our partners, the Thirst Collective. Publish Peace is a campaign to inspire every believer to share their testimony on social media under that hashtag. Throughout 2022, brands under the Thirst Collective will also be publishing stories about the goodness of God that transforms lives. So we are thankful to be able to partner with the Thirst Collective to encourage and equip Christians to be able to share our stories on social media. And finally, for phase 3, over the Easter weekend, we are encouraging churches, organizations, and small groups to host digital days of outreach, where groups of Christians and Christian communities can come together to intentionally reach out to their networks and friends over social media and other digital platforms. So we want to encourage you to join us, to be empowered and activated, to be ready to reach everyone around you. If you'd like to know more about Hashtag Ready, please go to crew.sg/ready to find out more. You can see the QR code right there as well. Allow me to just give you some brief announcements before I introduce this evening's webinar and speaker. Well, next up in our Hashtag Ready webinar series, we have Digital Outreach Made Simple by my husband Simon and myself. We are both staff and senior digital strategists from Crew Singapore. Come and hear how to live your life on mission and how to approach evangelism online with confidence. And you will see that digital outreach is simple and everyone can play a part. You can still sign up at crew.sg/be-ready. Another announcement is that, are you a mom and you want to learn how to be a light for Christ as a mom in this season of your life? Or you know mothers who are in this season of life as well? Then join this 4-part training series to learn how to share Christ simply through your own unique stories. You will also have opportunities to use your stories to engage with other pre-believing mothers after the training. This training is organized by Wow Mom, Women of Worth, Moms on Mission. It's a Cru ministry that reaches out and ministers to mothers. So sign up here at cru.sg/readymom1. And finally, Cru's Media Ministry has specially curated a list of resources to help you share your faith. Titles like Sharing Jesus Without Freaking Out, Coffee Shop Conversations, Telling the Gospel Through Story, and many, many more. So please check out these helpful resources here at cru.sg/readymedia. Now let me get to the webinars. I mentioned that I will give a brief recap of what we've learned so far in case you've missed any of them. We had Pastor Norman Ng from 316 Church who kicked off our webinar series with The Christian Influencer. One of our main takeaways from his session is that a social media space, instead of competing, we can complete and complement each other and help other ministries to succeed as well in reaching out to influence as many people as possible. It is a win-win situation. And Chu Li Min, a campus mentor from Cru Singapore, shared with us some very practical conversational hacks in evangelism. I was greatly reminded by Li Min that when we are intentional in connecting with people, God would bring us divine opportunities and we can join God in loving people together. Next, Isaac Ong shared with us about how to be yourself and still be an evangelist on social media. And he shared that when something is awesome, we won't hesitate to share it. So understanding that the beginning of evangelism is not how do I share, it's not about the techniques or the how-tos, but it's only when we deeply experience and know the beauty of God in our lives, when we are so convinced of it in our hearts, then our mouths will speak from this overflow. Well, if you missed any of our previous webinars, you can still catch up on them on our website, cru.sg/watchagain. Right, cru.sg/watchagain. Well, tonight we are in for a treat. We are going to hear from Fong Li Ling. She's going to share with us how to use our life stories to connect and engage with others and lead them to spiritual conversations. Well, I've known Li Ling for at least 20 years. In fact, she used to babysit my kids when they were still very young. Right now, she's got 2 kids of her own. Back then, we were in the creative communications ministry together. And Li Ling has over 10 years of experience teaching individuals how to write their stories. Stories have been an indispensable part of her life since her childhood, and she hardly leaves the public library empty-handed. And even so, more so now, as a mom herself to 2 young avid readers. And she's currently a story coach in Cru Singapore. So let us welcome Li Ling to share with us. You have a story, tell it. Over to you, Li Ling.
Hi, a very good warm welcome to all of you. Welcome to this webinar. You have a story, tell it. Let me just get set up right here. And it's a little bit about myself. Lillian has already introduced quite a big part of me, and just want to introduce you to my family. The picture you see right here is a picture of my 2 boys and my husband. My husband Elvin and I have been married for 11 years this year. And our 2 boys are Seth, the one in glasses, he's 9 years old. And then there is John, who is going to turn 6 this year. Yeah, so that's my family. And, very often people think that they have no story to tell. But tonight I will debunk this, okay? And I'll also give you handles on how to tell your story. A lot of times when we think about story, we think of the word testimony. And we associate testimony with some kind of miraculous, dramatic, life-changing event. For example, the stories of ex-offenders who found God and experienced a 360-degree turnaround in their lives. Or people who received instant healing from God when they were prayed for. Or perhaps, some kind of miraculous turnaround in a crisis situation. Basically, a happening that is so supernatural that cannot be explained by logic. The thing is, with such stories, and if your own salvation story is as dramatic as these, they are great and they are powerful. The problem is that most of us do not experience such dramatic change, much less in a constant, manner. And as a result, we might feel that, actually, I don't have a story to tell. But is that really true? I like to propose that our stories can also be the following. Stories of us discovering who we are, who God is, and what God is doing through life circumstances. If you make a life map of the significant milestones in your life, not just physical ones, but emotional ones, the ones that really mark your heart, I'm pretty sure that you have more than one story to tell. I have here 3 stories as examples, and please don't worry about taking notes or trying to find out where you can view or read these stories, because all the notes from today's slide deck have already been compiled, and there's also a list of resources in the document that will be sent to you after the webinar. For those of you who are viewing on YouTube, you'll be able to find the notes after the webinar uploaded on the Crew website. So I have here 3 stories as examples. Doug Bender, he tells his story about his quest for one good friend and to feel belonged. Scott Hamilton, he was a decorated figure skater in the 80s, and his story is one of multiple health crises and plot twists, and it is one of my favorite stories to hear. And just last week on Thursday, Connie, whose birthday falls on Valentine's Day, she candidly shares her struggles of being single at 35 in the form of a letter to herself. So these are stories where individuals share, discovering who they are, who God is, and what God is doing through their life circumstances. And then there are also stories of our day-to-day happenings and experiences that we can share. These stories may not necessarily mention God in them, but they reflect you and your thoughts on life. For example, I wrote a story once about my relationship with my dad that was triggered by a conversation that we had. The context is that it was near the time I was preparing to move out of my parents' home because I was getting married. And in the story, I reflected on my father's love for me throughout my life up to that point in time. It could be stories about your passions, your interests, like what Isaac mentioned in the last webinar, or any lifestyle habits that you might have. Or it could be simply just something that you feel for and sharing that. If you're still not convinced that you have a story, stick around with me as I walk through our agenda for tonight. Just 2 things. Why do we need to write and tell our stories? And handles on how to tell our stories. So let's move on to the why. Why do we need to tell our stories? The idea of this is that God is not merely the creator of our lives, He is also the author of our lives. I'm sure we all love stories. We watch Netflix, we read, we watch movies. Facebook, Instagram, they even have a feature called Insta Stories. We all love stories. And if the Bible is a grand story of what God has done, doesn't that make him the master storyteller? And what's the implication of that? That he would have written and is still writing the stories that make up our lives, isn't it? And as I mentioned in the above examples, we have so many stories that we can share. And these stories, they uniquely hold the message of the gospel. There is no one on earth like you or me. God doesn't create counterfeits or AAA grade imitations. Some people they may not step into a church or read the Bible, and your stories might just be the very thing that preaches the gospel to them. Finally, and most importantly, telling your stories bring healing and truth to you first. While God has commanded us to be his witnesses, I would like you to realize that God is equally, if not more, interested in forming you first. He's more interested in your being than what you or your story can do for him. when we reckon with what God is doing in our hearts in the different seasons of our journey with Him, and take time to make sense of and make record of the stories that He is telling with our lives, we are preaching the good news to ourselves first. As Christians, we also need the gospel. You know, a few years ago, my family were at a gathering, and Seth had a huge meltdown because he lost multiple times at a foosball game, table soccer. And Alvin was with him while Seth was like screaming his lungs out and Alvin was telling Seth repeatedly that losing is part of the game. And what is most important is not winning or losing, but his attitude and how, you should come back to try again despite losing. But little did Alvin know that the next day, his team would lose at a soccer game 7-0. And the thing is that Alvin was actually the goalkeeper, so it totally made the loss even worse. And so Alvin was nursing his wounds over the defeat and decided to share the lesson that God was teaching him on Facebook. And after he wrote the post, Alvin said, I feel better after writing it. Rather than wallow in defeat, Alvin chose to take his emotions to God, process them in the light of God's truth, and told his story. In turn, he experienced healing and could move on more easily. Telling our stories, especially the ones that are meant to communicate how God has transformed us, it requires us to face up to how we feel in a particular situation and processing what those emotions mean for us. And emotions are amoral. They are just signals of something going on at a deeper level, and they do not define who we are. And before I say anything further about processing your emotions, I would like to point out a caveat. If you have suffered any sort of trauma or abuse and you wish to share your story, but you find it difficult to process your emotions that arise from that traumatic or abusive situation, please do seek help from a mental health professional that's trauma-informed to help you with your emotional processing first. Or perhaps you might have not gone through trauma or abuse, but you have difficulty processing your emotions on your own to write your story. Do ask to speak to a trusted individual in your life whom you know is able to hold space and listen to you without judgment to help you to do that. If you don't have such a person in your life, do consider speaking to a counselor or mental health professional as well. Alternatively, you can also send a request to the Ready team to request for a story coaching session with me. So going back to, having to process our emotions in order to tell our stories. When we say, no lah, what story do I have to tell? What are we really saying? Do we really believe that? Or are we censoring and silencing ourselves just like how we censor and silence our own emotions? Because it feels too painful, too vulnerable, and takes up too much energy to be truthful to ourselves and to God. Alvin and I, we got married in 2011. And just before we celebrated our first wedding anniversary, I found out that I was pregnant. It was a mix of shock and surprise because we did not expect ourselves to have a child so soon. It was not within the plan. But since we did want children anyway, we embraced the unexpected and we moved on. Little did we know that 1 month after the news of my pregnancy, our lives would be thrown into major upheaval. Alvin's mother suffered a severe stroke, and welcoming a child in the face of a parent's health crisis felt ill-timed, and honestly, it felt more like a cruel joke to me. There were times in the first 12 weeks of my pregnancy that I asked God, why did you give us a child now? Only to stop myself short and not continue processing my emotions because I thought that my negative emotions would affect my baby. Tears would brim in my eyes, but I refused to allow them to take over me because I did not give myself permission to show up to how I truly felt. Nor did I give myself permission to celebrate the new life that was given to us, because in light of Alvin, who was overwhelmed on all sides, looking after his mother's affairs and grieving over the loss of his mother's cognitive and physical abilities, I felt that the baby and I should rank lower in importance. If anyone's needs should come first at that time, it should be his mother's and his. I did not know it then, but the suppression of all these emotions, they eventually would turn into something else to come back and haunt me. Christian psychologist and spiritual director David Benner, he said this: Christian spirituality involves a transformation of the self that occurs only when God and self are both deeply known. Both, therefore, have an important place in Christian spirituality. There is no deep knowing of God without deep knowing of self, and no deep knowing of self without a deep knowing of God. When we shut the door to how we truly feel in a given situation, we inadvertently shut God out in the process. When I refuse to allow myself to feel my joy, my sadness, my bewilderment of why I was caught in between two very polaric, life-changing events, I was not able to know God as my comforter or the lover of my soul. I was not able to sense his presence abiding with me because I refused to let him into the deepest, truest part of me. I knew he was faithful to our family, circumstantially and intellectually. But when it came to the complexity of my emotions I faced then, I did not experience a transformational knowing of God in my heart. I did not wrestle with God, unlike what Jacob did in Genesis 32, verse 22 to 28. Just allow me to give you a bit of a context to this scripture before I go on to reading it. So this is Jacob, okay, whose name also carries the meaning of someone who seizes, who circumvents, or usurps. In a plot twist, he got outwitted by his father-in-law to marry Leah, who's the older sister, right? Instead of his first choice, who was the younger sister, Rachel. By God's providential intervention, he managed to outwit his father-in-law of a whole lot of speckled flock. And now he's back to meet his elder brother Esau, whom Jacob cheated the birthright out of. So obviously, if you cheated your brother's birthright, you'll be very fearful, right? In this journey coming back to see your elder brother. And so what he did was that he sent a whole entourage ahead of his family with gifts for Esau, which I presume is an attempt to appease Esau. And so God has orchestrated the events of Jacob's life, leading to this very moment where Jacob will meet with God. And so Genesis 32, verse 22 to 28. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. And the man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." In this literal wrestle with God, Jacob emerged a different person. He was given a new name. And in the Bible, whenever you're given a new name, it symbolizes a new identity. For example, Simon, his name was changed to Peter. Jacob was touched by God in 2 ways in this wrestle, metaphorically and physically. He left with a permanent limp that will remind him of this moment of transformation forever. And sometimes, like Jacob, there are situations in our lives where we need to wrestle with God figuratively. And let me assure you, God can handle our questions and our petulance. He might not answer our questions in the way that we expect, but I assure you he can handle us, our weaknesses, our shame, inadequacies, struggles, and for lack of a better term, he can handle our shit. He can handle all this from us. And when we allow him and his good news, his truth to enter into our hearts, we will be changed. We will survive the heartache with a story to tell. And most importantly, we will know God and ourselves even deeper. Before I move on to the next part of tonight's webinar, I'd like to take a moment for us to pause and to pray. If you could join me, please close your eyes if it's convenient for you. Perhaps some of you, there is something that you sense God surfacing in your heart. It could be something that happened long ago that you thought you had resolved, but you feel like, God is pressing a finger on it now. Perhaps it's a time in your life you haven't been able to make sense of. Or perhaps it's something that, you have been holding on to, but God has been asking you to give it to him instead. Whatever it might be, God is inviting you to look at it squarely in the face and to let him into that story. He wants to be part of that story. Allow me to pray for us. Father, I thank you that you've made each one of us unique. We are your workmanship, each one, fearfully and wonderfully made in your image, reflecting your glory. And just like how Adam and Eve walked uninhibitedly in their flesh before the fall, you desire us to come before you just as we are, warts and all. And I know for a fact that you do not despise us. Regardless of where we've been and what we've done, you never despise us. Tonight, as we think about what you've written and what you are still writing in our lives, would you give us the grace to accept the person that we are now, while looking at you with hope that you will not leave us the way we are. Help us to lay ourselves bare before you and reveal our hearts to you. And as you shine your light and truth on our hearts, I pray that you also give us grace to believe and embrace who you have called us to be, your beloved child in whom you are well pleased. And from that place, may we be able to piece together and write the unique stories you have written in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. So I'm not sure how many of you actually looked at the list of questions that I sent beforehand and actually attempted to write your stories. If you have, good on you. I think you would find the next section helpful in helping you to refine what you have already written. For those of you who have not, tried your hand at, writing your story, it's okay. I hope that the session tonight will actually inspire to do that right after this. So we'll move on to how to write our stories in a way that is connecting, that is authentic. So the idea here is to bring others one step closer to Christ by revealing your heart. And here are some elements that make up a good story. Firstly, it shares about life. It awakens people to felt needs. It builds rapport and connection with a purpose. It introduces the topic of God or highlights God's values or design for mankind. For example, treating everyone with respect and dignity, faithfulness in a relationship, desiring a purposeful and significant life. These are common ideas and values that everyone wants in life. And when we can awaken someone to a particular value of God's kingdom, you're not only communicating to them what life is meant to be like, you're planting that desire in them for that abundant life that God has intended for all of us. And by God's grace, as we share the truth of the kingdom, that seed would cause them to start searching for God. And ideally speaking, if you are going to verbally, share your story, it should not take too long, about 3 to 6 minutes. It describes something that God is doing or has done in your life. and it may or may not mention Jesus Christ, because you don't, I mean, if for people who are, for those who have watched Lee Min's webinar, she talks about the Engel scale, and there are people who are perhaps closed off to God. And if you share a story that talks about Jesus, that might turn them off. So what are stories that you can share from your life that perhaps you can share in a way that doesn't necessarily have to bring in the name Jesus, but still communicates a change of values, or a change of attitude and behavior that you have been through in your life, and communicate that sort of hope for change and transformation that they are looking for. So when you share your stories, there are also the facts. So basically, you are making a point of who was involved, what happened, when you did it, where you did it, and how you did it. So these paint the facts in your story. But facts are insufficient, because you can share facts and still not reveal who you are. So as much as facts help people to understand the context and background of your story, you are just communicating on the surface and there's no heart. And you end up sounding like the following examples. So the first one, I began to take God seriously when I went to the army. During that time, I experienced a lot of hardship, to the point where I realized that I needed God so badly that without him, I'm nothing. I began to trust him, and he became my source of comfort and strength. So, this story, it's common, right, in the army to face difficulties and challenges and hardship physically and even emotionally. And the person who wrote this, he talked about how he experienced hardship. So there was the painting of the facts and the realization that he needed God. But you realize that there are details that are missing, details that would help people who have been through a similar situation to connect. Those details are missing. So what exactly was it that you experienced? At what point did that this person realize that he needed God? All these details are missing, and it fails to connect with the audience at a deeper level. And it doesn't actually cover what was that particular turning point at which this person begins to trust God, and how God became his source of comfort and strength. Another example would be, recently my family went through a tough time, and I was hanging on to God at the tip of the rope with many questions and doubts about God. But through it all, I realized God's faithfulness in everything, even though I don't see his hands specifically all the time. This is slightly better than the previous one, in that, there's some descriptive language, hanging on to God at the tip of the rope. And this person is actually open about, the many questions and doubts about God. But again, what is missing is, what exactly was this person asking? What exactly was the doubt that he or she had? And again, there is a missing whole lot of detail in what transpired between him or her having doubts, and then moving on to finally seeing God's faithfulness, even though the person doesn't see God's hands all the time. So you get the idea, right? It's like, when you eat a hamburger and there is no liao, there's no filling. So you're only left with the burger bun. And so the story becomes flat and there's no flavor. Sometimes it's not intentional, but because of time constraints, we feel compelled to stick to the bare facts, and we neglect to share the little details. But the truth is, we need to set the setting, for the audience, the sounds, the sights, the smells, which might seem minor, but they really profoundly affect us and help us get associated with the emotions in the story and actually make the story come alive. When we stick only to the bare facts, what happens is we turn the corner too quickly. What that means is we leave the listener a bit disconnected and sometimes a bit puzzled, like, okay, how did you jump from this point to the next point? So we need to help the person who is listening to our story or reading our story understand and connect better with us by painting the picture for them, painting the emotional landscape behind the physical situation. in order to achieve connection and authenticity. I think we are all on social, I mean, most of us are on social media, and we can tell whether someone is real or fake, right? And if the person is not being authentic with you, I'm pretty sure you can tell from the way the person writes. And so for ourselves who are going to share our story, that we cannot run away from that. Okay. We have to be upfront with how we feel. And it's not just about the good things that happen to us. What about the challenges that we face? What about the struggles that we face? If we cannot be authentic and real about that, how do we then show that God is real in those times, right? And so when we talk about establishing connection and authenticity in our stories, it's very important to talk about why, why I did something. What was my motivation? What was my intention? What are my convictions? What are the things that I would stake my life on? And very important, the emotions that are attached to the facts. All these elements, they help you paint a mental picture for your audience, and they add depth and richness to the reader or the listener experience. You can also make use of literary devices that even scripture contains, so as to communicate God's intentions and his heart more effectively. It helps people to have a clearer understanding of what you are saying and allows the audience to connect what they hear to their heart. I have a list here. It's by no means exhaustive, and the categories might overlap as well. I will not go through the list one by one. It will be in the document that you will receive post-webinar. And again, for people who are going to tune in on YouTube, it will be on the website. So you can, there's also explanations and examples in the document, so you can take a look at those notes after the webinar. So, elements of writing a personal story. These are pretty important writing pointers that I would like us to pay attention to. Firstly, write your story the way you speak and not the way you write. This is important because, a lot of times when we write something, it can sound different from the way we speak. And we also tend to use words in our writing that might not be words that we use in our speech. And so what we want is to be conversational in the way that we write our story. So avoid using big words or bombastic language or like academic language or words that are just too difficult to understand. Use words that you would use when you're speaking to a friend. So think conversationally, like you're sharing this to an enlarged, like having an enlarged conversation. So bear in mind, right, if you're going to post your story on social, think about who are the people on your followers list. Who are the people who will be reading this story, and write the story the way you would when you speak to them. And of course, use language that your audience would understand. In the Christian community, we have a lot of terminology that non-Christians don't understand. Avoid the Christianese, We like to use big words that require unpacking, like, for example, salvation or sin. These are actually very big words that mean very different things to non-Christians, or they might not even know what it means. And so if you really need to use Christian or biblical terms in your story, make sure that you define them so that people who read your story or who hear your story are on the same page as you. Secondly, relate to your big idea. Don't, tell a long grandmother story and end up not saying anything. Constantly go back to the main point that you're communicating about God through your story. Thirdly, find the common ground between the context of who you are and the context of your audience. So again, like I mentioned earlier, who are these people on your social? Who is this particular person that you are talking to? What is this person's context? And where is the common ground between that person's context and yours? I'm not sure if you've heard of the phrase context is everything. What it basically means is that context shapes the meaning in all communication. Without context, right, you cannot communicate effectively. So what's the situation your audience is in? What story from your life would be connecting to this person or these people at this point in your lives? Finally, paint a realistic picture of the Christian life. You know, the Christian life is not a bed of roses. You know, we have our challenges, we have our questions, we have our doubts. There are times in our Christian walk where we might go through a dry season and we feel like God is not around. And that's hard, right? But at the same time, the Christian life is not all hard, right? Like we go through triumphs, we go through joys. There are days where there are times in seasons in our lives where we know that God is present. So do communicate both sides of the story. Do not paint the Christian life as any easier than it actually is, but don't make it sound harder also. Yeah. So in summary, when it comes to the how, I would like to give you this picture of a burger. So basically, right, if you imagine with me, there's the bottom bun. So the bottom bun, right, is like the trigger. So your first bite must compel the second. Like when you eat a burger, when you first bite into it, it must be shook enough, right? Flavorful enough to want you to eat again. So your first bite must compel the second. Then there's the flavor, which is the details to your story that add depth and richness to the reader or listener experience. So this is your liao, your patty, your cheese, your, I don't know what you like, onions, your, you know, egg, bacon, whatever. Things that add flavor and add depth and richness to your reader. And finally, the top bun, which is the kicker. Start with the end in mind for a satisfying landing. Always know where you are going with your story so that when it all comes together, it all makes sense to the person who is reading it. Okay? So earlier on, I shared that, you know, because I did not accept and embrace my true emotions in the situation that I was in, they became something else that came back to haunt me at a later time. So our first son, Seth, now 9 years old, he was born in January 2013. And right from the point of delivering him, right, my expectations of childbirth and mothering, they just all spiraled out of my control. He had to be born via surgery instead of naturally, as I had planned and wished for, because there was a medical emergency at that time. And I struggled tremendously with my new role as a mother because I was insistent on breastfeeding him despite having a low milk supply. His temperament as a baby was also very challenging for us as new parents. You know how, you know, like some babies, right? They start off with this soft cry and then it gradually gets louder. For Seth, it's all or nothing. He simply goes from quiet to full on raging scream cry, okay? And he'll cry, like raging cry, when we need to change his diaper. He would cry when we gave him a bath. It was very stressful. He also napped very little as a baby, so it was very tough to get any like pockets of rest. So long story short, I was exhausted physically and emotionally. Pretty much, I mean, all new moms are like that. On hindsight, I probably was suffering from some shade of like postpartum depression, but I was fully functioning, so I didn't think that I needed help, so I didn't do anything about it. I'm embarrassed and actually shameful to say this, but for a good few years of Seth's life, right, I did not feel affection for him. Yeah, I felt that I was taking care of him out of responsibility and not love. And I felt guilty about that. There was also like bitterness, times when I felt, you know, why are you so difficult to care for? So fast forward to 2018. By then, John was already born, my younger son, and he was a drastically different child from his brother. And our lives were pretty much stable by then. You know, after the whole like my mother-in-law stroke and having transit to becoming a new parent. So by 2018, our lives were pretty stable. And finally in 2018, God had my attention. A friend of mine, she had a newborn son and was struggling with his sleep patterns, just like I did with Seth. As I read about her struggles on Facebook, see, when you share your story, you other people will get connected, okay? So she shared her struggles on Facebook, and it brought me back to the time when Seth was a newborn and all the emotions that I felt back then. It was not simply like a memory, you know, it was like my body actually still remembered the struggle and the pain that it went through. And I had this like distinct feeling in my body. And it was then that I knew that something was still not right. You know, I knew at that moment that whatever I felt, I had unfinished business with God. So in June 2018, I went for a solo silent retreat. It was my first silent retreat and also my first time traveling overseas alone. It was also the first time that I told God and myself how exactly I felt back then in 2012 and 2013 when my whole life just spun out of my control. I finally allowed myself to grieve over the unmet expectations that I had of the experiences and emotions that one would have when expecting a first child because of a crisis in our lives that required more of our attention and Alvin's attention. So at the retreat center, right, I get to meet this spiritual director like pretty much every day. And he made this remark when I shared these things with him. He made this remark. He said, "It took you 6 years." Yeah, it took me 6 years, okay, to face up to how I really felt. And it's such an irony, okay, because here I am, I'm talking to you about, you know, like facing up to your own emotions, right? But it took me 6 years when I've been the one telling people to face up to their emotions in order to tell their story. So yeah. So even though you know these things, there are times when you also shut yourself off. Yeah, because it can be too difficult to handle at that moment. And it was also in that retreat that I was finally able to give thanks for Seth's life and crucially embrace my role as a mother, which was something that I had not been able to do because I had, you know, numbed my emotions back then, thinking that doing so would help me move on and deal with life. And that could not have been further from the truth. All of my grief, it leaked out in unhealthy ways as I parented Seth in the early years of his life. And that is like a big regret for me. So since the retreat, I promised myself to show up to my emotions and accept myself. This doesn't mean that I can go like batshit crazy on people and act up, okay? Okay, to paraphrase David Banner, it means accepting the unpleasant truths of my existence and not rationalizing or denying responsibility for my behavior. He goes on to say that if God loves and accepts us as sinners, how can we do less? We can never be other than who we are until we are willing to embrace the reality of who we are. Only then can we truly become who we are most deeply called to be. If God has made each of us unique and He loves each of us so, so dearly, wouldn't He want us to embrace that uniqueness as our reality? And when we are fully alive in Him, knowing our truer selves and knowing Him, then the stories that we tell, the way that we share our faith would truly reflect Him and captivate the hearts of people who need to hear it. And so, you know, after I've said so much, how about you? What is your story? I hope the webinar would have given you enough reasons and handles to write your own stories. And I highly recommend that if you already feel like there's something, you know, to be written, please do it immediately after this because everything is fresh in your mind right now. Could you take a minute now to write in the chat, you know, what is one takeaway that you had from tonight's webinar? Could you do that for me? What is one takeaway that you have from tonight's webinar. Okay, while you're thinking and writing about, considering, sharing your thoughts with us, it will help me very much that you could scan the QR code and share your feedback on the webinar with me. Or if you have any questions that you wish to ask privately or story coaching requests, you can email the Ready team, and they will direct those to me as well. Or you can share your stories to the Ready Telegram group, where some of us are already interacting. Thanks for those of you who are writing your takeaways. There is a Q&A button that you can click on and type in your questions. So feel free to upvote those questions that you'd like to see answered, and we will try our best to answer as many questions as time allows. Thanks for those of you who are writing your takeaways. And again, if I will appreciate if you could give us your feedback. You could scan this QR code or go to the link below. And if you have any questions in private or coaching requests, you can email the Ready team. So as you continue reflecting, if you have questions, again, do let us know in the Q&A board, and then we can address those questions. Let me see. Oh, okay, I see your. All right, the questions are coming in. Just let me take a look at them. Okay, I'll take the first questions that came up. What are some platforms you suggest that we begin sharing our personal stories, especially if our regular social media posts are mostly about daily lives? Will our story look strange if we share or post out of the blue? Okay, so I would think that when you say regular social media, you would mean Facebook and Instagram. Well, I think for stories, right, it really depends on who your audience is. Does your audience know that you are a Christian? Like, have you been open about that all along? If you are, I think it's okay to go ahead and, talk about something a little bit more serious or something a little bit more heavy once in a while. It's like, heavy things don't happen to us all the time, right? And it's definitely not going to be the things that pepper our whole social media feed. So I think if you are desiring to share maybe something that happened to you that was a big thing, I think it's okay that you are suddenly sharing about that. I feel like if you have been open about your identity as a Christian, that you worship God, that you follow God, that would already be part of your identity online, and bringing God in and talking about God through other aspects of your life, that would not come as a surprise. But if, let's say, in your daily postings, you don't actually talk so much about your spiritual life or your spiritual journey, or even like mention God, maybe start with intentionally mentioning that aspect of your life, because we want our lives on social media and our daily life to be congruous. It's not, we don't want to compartmentalize our life because it is meant to be lived as a whole, right? So if you want to talk about the serious stuff at some point, or you want to talk about, this thing that God has done for you, or this thing that you are still trusting God for, perhaps you can consider injecting bits of your life with God on social media as well. Then that would help your audience to be more comfortable knowing who you are as a whole person. And then when you talk about the challenges and want to share something God has done, it won't come as like a shock. Okay, but having said that, as long as your story is authentic, like you are genuinely sharing it from your heart, and it is a real and true experience, I think that in itself is enough to catch people's attention and for them to read your story. Yeah. Okay, I am going to move on to the next question. I have many stories from my daily activities that are significant to me, and I'd love to tell them. Oops. But after putting some thought to it, I am worried that people would find it trivial and insignificant. Should I keep on sharing them? Yes, you should. Like I mentioned earlier, right? Our life is not always made up of very intense moments. Yeah. We are we are human beings, we have many different aspects of our lives. And when you share all these little things, right, you are actually connecting with your audience on those things. For example, if I'm a tea drinker, I like to drink tea, and I also like matcha. So if that is going to be part of my daily activity and my daily routine, it's something that establishes connection with other people who have the same daily routine. Okay, it might seem very minor lah, and like, insignificant, like you mentioned in your question, but it builds that sense of identity. People know that, oh, this so and so, you are a tea drinker, you like this, you like that, this is part of your life. And then by and by, right, as you talk about all these so-called minor and insignificant things, right, they know, once they know who you are and who you're made up to be, when you share like a more serious, a more heavy subject, it helps them to kind of form that impression of already who you are, and what you say would connect to them as well. So don't worry about the how minor or how small that daily happening is. It makes up all of you, and it's part of your life. So be open to share it. Yeah. Okay, I am not an avid reader. What if I cannot find the words to adequately express my experience or emotions? So can I assume that your concern is that you don't have enough vocabulary? Maybe this person can kind of clarify what you mean by not being able to find the words to adequately express. Like, are you asking about not having enough vocabulary, or are you asking about how do you actually paint the picture for the audience to fully understand what you went through? I will come back to this question, okay, if you can help me to clarify your question in the chat. Moving on to the next question. How long should my story be? I am concerned about it being too long. I believe Instagram has a word limit. So if you go by that, then the caption limit should be as long as that limit is lah. So I'm not sure exactly the number of words, but I'm pretty sure Instagram captions have a word limit. So go by that, because if it's going to be longer than that, you won't be able to post it on Instagram at all. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. The next one. I've been staying away from social media for a long time to avoid distractions and to save time. I hear you. I'm totally like this. Based on these ready sessions, I understand that it's a good platform which I should not miss. Should I get back, and how can I initiate and get a hearing? By hearing, you mean a following? Is that what you mean? I think it's good to know where your boundaries are. And as you mentioned that you want to avoid distractions and to save time, what you can do is actually limit the amount of time that you are on the platform. So if your main intention is that you want to connect with your friends and your wider network, or even your non-Christian friends through social media, then be very focused on that goal. Yeah. And set a time for yourself. How much time am I going to spend writing my posts? And actually, one thing you can do is you can plan your post ahead and schedule when you want the post to go up. So you are not actually spending time scrolling so much, but you are very intentional in how you want to spend time on that platform. Yeah. So whether you should get back on or not, I cannot answer that question for you, because it is ultimately your personal decision whether you want to use this platform to connect. But if you are, then I suggest you set a time limit for yourself, and then you plan your time, how much time you want to spend crafting your posts and answering to the comments and things like that. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. Hi, Edward. You say that you feel more natural speaking in a video than writing in text, and you feel awkward using literary language. Okay. Can a video be as effective or more effective? Yes, you can use a video for sure. You can do stuff on like IG using videos. You can shoot yourself sharing your personal story, or one of the examples that is in the list of resources in the document that will be sent to you later is the story that I talked about earlier on about my dad. That one was a video, but it's a compilation of photos. So my story is told via voiceover over the photos. So if you don't want to like shoot yourself, sharing your story, which can be a little bit awkward, you can actually do that. Like you put like photos, and then using the photos to kind of like explain, to like help to illustrate your story. Yeah. So if you feel awkward using literary language, you don't have to. Yeah. So it's not a must lah. Yeah, it's just a suggestion. Yeah. The person who talked about him or herself not being an avid reader, I'm still waiting for your clarification. Okay. Next question. How long does it take for me to write stories? It's quite difficult to write content that is in the moment. Sorry, hang on. Let me try to understand your question. It's quite difficult to write content that is in the moment, since editing also takes time. I assume you are saying that you want to write stories that are happening to you, and talk about it immediately. Generally, can you clarify for me why you want to do that? Like, what do you mean by content that is in the moment? Yeah, could you clarify that in the chat, and I'll come back to you? Because some stories, depending on what the subject matter is, take longer to write than others. So, for example, the story that I shared about what happened in my family, and as a result, me having taken 6 years to process that one is like many years in the making. So, when you say how long does it take for me to write, it really varies. So when you say content that is in the moment, can you clarify what you mean? Then I'll come back to you. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question. In the past, I've shared stories in two parts. The first part in a less Christian, more secular way. Then I attach a second part talking more about my reflections from a Christian point of view. Can I ask why you do that? Like why you feel the need to like separate the two? And also on which platform do you share this way? That would help me to answer whether the format is fine or not. Okay. Yeah, if you could clarify for me, please. I will come back to your question. Okay, sorry, there's a question which has been severely upvoted. I was taught to write my testimony to always point back to Jesus. However, you said that the story doesn't necessarily have to include Jesus. Yes. How do I relate back to Jesus without mentioning him, or is that not possible? Okay, good. Okay, great question. So yes, traditionally we have always been taught that your testimony, whenever you share a testimony, it has to talk about Jesus. But okay, so I don't know whether you attended Li Min's session. If you never, you can go to crew.sg/watch again to watch again, where she talks about the angle scale. So the angle scale, right, is essentially it essentially is a scale that tells us that there are people are not always, at the verge of receiving Christ. We meet people who are from all walks of life, made out of all sorts of beliefs and worldviews, right? About what the worldviews that they have about God, and whether they even like the idea of God or not. So if let's say you meet someone who is like super far away from the point of being open to God, and you try to tell them about God, sometimes it actually turns them off. Yeah. So for people like that, right, I recommend that maybe you don't be so overt, especially if you are talking to that person one-on-one. Of course, if you are talking about like posting it on your social, then you can say whatever you like because it's your social, it's your account, right? And all you have to do is just to avoid Christianese. But if let's say you're talking to someone who is completely closed off to God, and your concern is that the person would not know Jesus if you don't put the name Jesus inside. Actually, right, it really is not so crucial about whether you mention the word Jesus, because it is more important to connect with that person at that person's level. Yeah. So if let's say you are going to share, let's say if I'm going to share my story about my struggle, the challenges that I face in my family, I would just tell them about what happened, as it is lah, like lay out the facts and just talk about my struggles with how my needs were not met, and how eventually when I was able to only when I was able to face up to it, that I was able to grieve and move on. Yeah. And I might possibly not include that, I went for this retreat, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So the whole point, right, is to connect with that person and let that person in and be authentic with that person as much as possible without turning that person away from God. I mean, of course, if you don't know whether that person is like I don't want to hear about Jesus, then you talk about Jesus and the person gets offended, then just say sorry, yeah. But yes, like Lillian mentioned, it's about building common ground and relationship. So it's more loving to speak that person's language rather than try to push our own agenda, yeah, into that conversation. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Okay, I think somebody clarified. At times I want to write on topics that are like, current affairs. Okay, my struggle is putting it out since I still go back. Oh, okay, I get what you mean now. Thank you. So if you want to write about current affairs, right, and like things that are hot button issues, my suggestion is do your research as much as possible. Be as nuanced as you can, and don't fuss about perfection. Yeah, because if you fuss over the perfecting it, then you will miss the timing. Yeah. So a rule of thumb with writing, right, is that don't go for perfection. Just write as perfectly as possible at that moment, especially if you are going to be writing more on like current affairs and hot button issues, and then just let it publish it. Okay. Of course, the fear that some people might have is, what if it's not nuanced enough, or what if it's not like, researched enough, and then maybe you will get comments that criticize you or whatever. But I think, as with all writing, you learn as you do it lah. Yeah. So if you are true to yourself, and if you are true to God, and if you have done your due diligence, then I say don't worry so much about perfecting the post. Okay. Okay. Next question. Okay, there's one with an upvote, so I'll address that. Should we be telling our story when it's unfinished? Something we are struggling with and not resolved or no answers yet? Or should we share after the fact, hindsight? Will it be discouraging to the listener if what we are sharing can be negative? For this, right, I would say it depends on how open you are to people engaging with you about it. Yeah, why I say that is because when you put a work in progress story out in public, right? What you are essentially doing is that yes, you are being vulnerable, which is a good thing, but you must also ascertain whether that issue is so raw, and whether you'll be able to engage on it, once you put it out. Yeah. I'm all for, talking about work in progress, because it just means that we are all imperfect and we are still working on things. What you can actually say sometimes in your story is that, I don't have answers and I'm still searching. You can also add, that if you want to ask me questions about it, please do it privately, so that people won't send comments on your public feed, and then everybody can see, and then people start talking when you're not ready to engage that way. So just bear in mind, so the short answer is yes, you can tell your story, but also know where you are at emotionally and whether you are able to engage if people were to ask you questions. Yeah. And then if you are not, to actually also state in your post that you are still processing, and it's something that you are trusting, or maybe it's something I'm still trusting God for, or things like that. Yeah. Okay. Next question. Should we persevere in trying to share our stories to people who are resistant, even derisive towards God and Christianity? I'm always at a loss at how to reach my friends when we meet in real life. We have had a few unpleasant exchanges, awkward silences when I try. So I just end up crafting posts on IG. It does feel like these stories are only appreciated by my Christian friends though. Yeah, I feel you. Should I change my approach? It really depends on where your Christian friends are at though. If like you mentioned, if you describe them as people who are resistant and derisive towards God and Christianity, then maybe I would say change your approach. Sometimes if they already know that you are a believer, if you have had several, awkward silences with them, I would assume that they know that you're a Christian. And if let's say they are not particularly open or welcoming when you share these stories, right, then maybe just focus on building that friendship first. Yeah. Don't need to hide the fact that you're a believer, or stop talking about God. But maybe when you talk about God, avoid being preachy, or at the end of the day, it's really about what Lillian mentioned in the chat earlier, is building common ground, building relationships. So my suggestion would be in order to maintain the friendship, what kind of things would you need to do? Reaching out to them is not always about just telling them about Jesus or inviting them to church. If they are not open to it, then what are other ways what are other ways that you can have to build that relationship with them? Sometimes it's just journeying through life with them. Yeah, I think Isaac mentioned something in the webinar also, like, when you hang out with friends, it's not always intense. Like, you don't always have all these intense conversations about like God, but it's just being with them in the day to day. And if they know that you're a believer, at some point when they face something in their life where they feel like, okay, I think this so and so, I think, this person might have some kind of solution for me, then they'll kind of look for you. Yeah. So I think you don't have to force it if it's awkward or like it's not well taken. You just have to be discerning about what they need. Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. I'm the person writing stories in two parts. I shared stories in Instagram stories. First my story part 1, then add another story for my reflections. I thought that by doing this, people who are not interested in Christianity can still read the story and just skip the last slide. Oh, okay, that's interesting. What kind of comments or feedback have you received though? I'm curious. Like, do you have people who comment on your stories? I mean, if it's a post, like, do people comment and like engage on your post or like your post at least? Because I think it's hard to tell whether it's a good format because I don't know what is the engagement that you receive. If the engagement has been good, then I suppose it goes well with your audience. But if not, then maybe you can. I mean, the reason why I ask like why you do it in two parts, right, is because sometimes, I mean, if we kind of dissect our audience like that, right? And I imagine if I'm one of your followers and I'm a non-Christian and you kind of like say what you want to say in like different, you kind of like categorize your story this way, then it feels a little bit awkward. Yeah. But I mean, if your engagement has been great, then yeah, please carry on. Yeah, why I say it's awkward is because it feels like you are kind of like targeting your content to a specific audience. And I feel like, okay, you are kind of like compartmentalizing information for me as an audience member. So when you see it on a feed, right, it is actually a little bit strange. Like I would recommend that we actually just share as, how to say, like make it uniform. So like if you are going to share your story, just share it as real, as authentic to you as possible with your audience in mind. So it's like, don't make a differentiation between I'm sharing this for like Christians or non-Christians. Yeah. Because if they are going to see everything, then it's like doesn't really make a difference. Yeah. So I think it doesn't matter like what your reflections are about God. If they know you as a believer, then yeah, it's just part of you, lor. So just avoid the Christianese lah. Yeah, I think it's a general rule of thumb. Okay, so do we still have time for one last question?
No, I think that's all the time we have. Yeah, thank you
Okay.
so much. Yeah, thanks, Li-Ling, for answering the questions, and thank you for all the questions that came in. We want to appreciate Li-Ling for your authentic sharing today. I think what struck me at the very start of your session is the question that you asked: why do we need to tell our stories? And the fact that God is the author of our lives, and He's written and is still writing these stories in our lives, and that our stories uniquely hold the message of the gospel. I think that really struck me, and that yeah, we all have these stories for a purpose, right? And when we tell them, we are telling the world about Jesus, in a very simple way, just by reflecting His presence in our lives. So thank you so much, Liling, for sharing and inspiring us with your experiences and your stories. And yeah, let's pray that we will also use the stories that God has written into our lives to uniquely share the gospel of Christ. So thank you so much. If you have more questions that you would like to ask Li-Ling, or your question was not answered because of time, please join our #Ready Telegram channel and post your questions there. Li-Ling will be more than happy to answer them and interact with you more. Yeah, so please join our Telegram channel. It's crew.sg/readytelegram1. Ready Telegram 1. And we have a brand new video about this Telegram journey, hot off the press, and we want to share it with you now. You're going to be the first people to watch it online. So let's watch it together.
For any of us, life can be busy, stressful, and overwhelming. These struggles can make it difficult to share the message of Jesus with the people around us. If someone asks about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. Sometimes we all need a helping hand in overcoming our fears and hesitation. Come hear others' stories, successes, and failures. Reconsider what evangelism means and learn to use your own stories so you're ready to live out and share your faith authentically. Let's journey together to reach everyone around you.
Yes, let's journey together to reach everyone around us. So join us, our community, on Ready Telegram 1. Now, if you have any other questions about #Ready or would like to explore partnership with us, please email us at ready.org.sg. Thank you so much once again for joining us tonight, to be equipped, to be ready to reach everyone around us. See you at our next webinar and in our Telegram community. God bless and good night.